opportunity to spend the next coming weeks thinking about church history and then relating this to history tonight. So we're very much looking forward to what you have for us here, and very much looking forward to the things that we can learn. We ask that you would directly connect each of these things to our ministries, to our lives, to our prospering and understanding your word better, and understanding how to think how you have worked in the past better. We ask this in your son's name. Amen. Okay, let me welcome each person that's coming in here, and just want to express my appreciation for your time here, your interest, and very much looking forward to getting to know some of you as the class progresses. So I'm excited about what we've got going on, but I am not going to spend time talking about that now, specifically because I want to use our time well with David Woodworth while we have him here. And so I'm going to just jump directly in that direction. Let me go ahead and give an introduction to him, and then I'm going to start. We're going to start heading off that direction to talk about some of those discussions. So I knew David going way back, actually back in grad school. I met him when he was taking Greek, and that was very impressive as a history major, had an interest in taking Greek. Then we were grad students, and we were on the same hall as graduate assistants. Very fun memories pop into my mind of coming out of my office. I was a Greek teacher. He was a history guy. Coming out of my office at 3 o'clock in the morning, and his light is on down in his office, and I bang on his door. What are you doing? And he's working on a paper, and I'm working on a paper. One point, we took a little walk together because it's 3 o'clock in the morning. We're both getting sleepy, but we got to get our papers done for the next morning. So took a little 3 o'clock in the morning cross-campus walk just to kind of breathe some fresh air and get back into things. So adventures there and lots of fun discussions during those years. Mm-hmm. That's been 10 years ago. David, since he did a Master's of Arts at BJU, then he did a Master's in Liberal Arts at Duke University, and so basically a second Master's in History. And then subsequent to that, now he is representing Oxford University Press and selling books. So into that all the time, into just that kind of maybe working with those kinds of things. David is a great guy to have history and thought-provoking conversations with. And that's basically where we're starting out today. Is I want to start off with a direction in preparation for thinking about church history with thinking about history in general. And I believe in that concept very strongly. Let me just toss this. I'm going to toss this into your court, David, and hit it back at me. So let's say from the perspective of someone who looks at history or church history as kind of its own discrete discipline and doesn't view it necessary really to integrate church history to history at large, or the discipline of history or historiography. Just give us some kind of ballpark context here to connect those two disciplines together and why it's necessary for a church historian to be a historian at large.
Okay. I think you've touched on kind of the crux of the problem right from the get-go of what I think church history needs and what I think good history practice is, and where those kind of intersect. Where to begin? I think first of all, the best place to begin is what is history, and I think we use this word in the English language, pass it around. It means something to all of us that is useful, but I think also there's a good deal of refining that needs to be. First of all, I think history is a distinct thing from the past. The past is a much larger set of data than what history is. The past is something that is to some degree not completely knowable. There doesn't matter what Winston Churchill had for breakfast the morning before a major speech. Most likely not. This is something we might know, we may not know, but it's in the past. So the past is a much larger data set. History seeks to make sense of the past. So a historian approaches a set of data that he defines as his research interest, or the book he's going to write, or the article, or the the endeavor he's going to take, and then seeks to, from the past, find what can be knowable about it, assemble it into some kind of meaningful usually written piece, and then edits, refines it, and publishes it. That's typically the process. So one of the things I kind of want to begin with is history is by nature taking these complex data sets and trying to make sense of them. So when we talk about objectivity, when we talk about an authoritative history, we always need to keep in mind that the reality of the past is something that's very complicated. It's very large, and to a certain degree, we just don't know. There are things we want to know. I'd love to know more about some of the intricacies of how the English Bible is preserved through printing. Pre-printing. There are scant records of. I know a little bit about the English Reformation, but pre-Bible publishing, there are completely illiterate. Records of completely illiterate farmers who have entire chapters of the Bible memorized. We don't really know a whole lot about how that happened. We can make some guesses. We have some evidence, but we just don't know. And it's kind of interesting, but we have to be clear from the get-go that history is our record of the past. It does not, shall we say, it's not complete. It's always contingent on a historian. I think it's another kind of clear concept to clarify. Any history is the product of someone's mind. So, they've made sense of data. They're going to make a strong argument based on the data they've selected that supports their argument. A good historian will be very clear about, especially in the footnotes, what data they've selected, what sources they're drawing from, what they want to know more of, where they're making some reasonable assumptions about what's going on, and then move forward from there with their argument, and always pay homage to what they know and don't know. That's I think.
Let me jump in and
go ahead.
Yeah. Here, I'll toss in two kind of pictures or ways of expressing this that capture it for me, and then you bounce off these. Mm-hmm. Okay, so one is an anecdote. There's this bomb that happens in the New York City Marathon. It's the pressure cooker bomb. I don't remember what year it was, 4 years ago. So they interview this guy immediately after. Okay, he's a brain surgeon. He's a very intelligent, articulate guy. They interview this guy, and they say, "What happened?" And he says, "I heard a bang. And then about 2 minutes later, I heard another bang." Okay. Well, you can watch the video of this, and it's like bang, bang. It's like 6 or 7 seconds. Okay. There's video of it. You can hear it. It's very definitively in that form. But his expression of that was about 2 minutes later. And what that represents is, boom, he was on adrenaline after the first bang. He's a doctor, and so he's looking around trying to help somebody. And for him, like 2 minutes goes by, okay? Mm-hmm. And what it represents is, and forensic analysis and this kinds of this kinds of analysis has demonstrated this as well. In, let's say, a court case, 2 different witnesses can see the same thing, and when interviewed separately, come up with very different impressions of what happened, okay? Now, those are people that are personal eyewitnesses. We're trying to establish things that happened however many, hundreds of years ago with minimal amounts of data that have passed through other people's interpretations already, maybe several layers of interpretation to get to us. Okay. So that's where we're getting a lot of the subjectivity coming in. And then secondarily, other kind of anecdote or picture that I got from Gaddis that I thought was super helpful, thinking of history like a map. So to really have an completely accurate map of, let's say, the Philippines, the only way to have a map that covers everything in the Philippines is to literally have the Philippines. Because, I don't know, this little gizmo that I'm holding in my hand isn't going to be on your map. But the fact is, if you recreate the Philippines, the entire Philippines, that's no longer a map because it's pointless. It's the whole Philippines. So every map is a summary, and you left a bunch of stuff out. You just you stripped down like 99.9% of it so that they can put it on a piece of paper and stick it in their pockets. History is a map of what we're talking about, all of that data spread over years. So we've added an additional dimension to it. It's now all of the Philippines over thousands of years. And we're trying to record that on a page to make it small enough that people can read it and comprehend it. Okay, I ran my mouth. Thoughts?
No,
build on that. What do you think?
That's a good metaphor. I actually know a few cartographers and geographers, and that is a struggle of their discipline, is how do we represent reality on paper or in a computer model, and how much does history take into account? Yeah, it's a good way of thinking about it. I would also bounce a weaver. If you've had any experience weaving, you select the threads. The weaver puts together the threads and begins to weave things together. That's another useful metaphor in thinking about how one person is creating something, selecting the threads that then make the narrative, as it were. Another person is going to see it completely differently, is going to make a different kind of argument from the facts, as it were. And I think it's important to realize history as a discipline, there is never going to be an authoritative account of the past. I think that's something that needs to be kind of emphasized for Christians who want to venture into the past. As a Christian who is a historian and who practices history, one can say I think one can make a clear distinction when talking about truth and the past. There are small t truths that historians are dealing with, so facts, things that one has to kind of order, evidence, as it were, and then big T truths, things we know to be true because we hold the Bible as authoritative, and to not get those confused. Trying to assemble facts to make an argument or to construct a narrative, which are the things that historians are essentially doing. I know a fair number of practicing academic historians as part of my job, part of my vocation, and they're all long-form arguers. They're all really good at arguing, and they do it in books. They're always arguing about something in very polite ways. You'll have three different people who all study the same time period and the same subject, who are good friends, but feel differently about what this means or that means. And there are some really big, sometimes big divides in that, but they all have a certain humility to how they approach their subject, some more so than others, in that they are bound by their evidence. They are essentially trying to do the same thing, but coming to some slightly different conclusions. And I think similar to your illustration about the bomb testimony, there's a famous kind of historiographical problem. Sojourner Truth, who's an ex-slave in the 1840s, late 1840s, gives a speech in Akron, and two journalists both are there, both do write-ups in various papers kind of describing the speech, and they both have wildly different accounts. And I think you have to give both of them credit, because they're both professional newspaper writers. They're both they're both credible people, but one of them chooses to do what seems to be a little kind of kind of a little creative interpretation, because there is a dialect involved, and someone in the American South, an uneducated female from the American South, roughly born in the late 18th century, would have a different way of speaking than perhaps the newspapers could print. And there's two different accounts. It's a problem. You're bound by your sources. You have this thing that happened. It's a famous speech. People were moved. It spawns kind of a little mini movement. It's an important kind of rallying cry for American abolitionist, anti-slavery people in the North. And there are two wildly different accounts that are credible. And a historian has to sit down and think, why is this account more credible than that account? And even though they both, as newspapers, are credible sources, a historian would look at a newspaper as a generally credible source. And I think it's a good way for a church historian to kind of look at source material. Yes, a historian is a very critical person. They're investigating, they're not trusting anyone, any one source, more than another unless there are grounds for it. They're always questioning everything, but you do run into problems where there are two legitimate sources that conflict. So what actually happened, we don't know. We know what happened after. We have more credible sources there, but this is one of the things. We're never going to know. And I think a church historian needs to be humble about what they know and don't know, and not extrapolate too far from the data set they have. I think that's a useful application of this particular problem. There's also another. Are you familiar with the? Well, go ahead.
Well, let me throw. I'm very interested to know about that problem too. Let me throw a kind of a directly church history type example. Okay, That's just, and I'm just picking something here, but okay. So, I want to think of Martin Luther in the heroic model, the person who is the spark that lights the Reformation, and so at the end of the rising tension of the Renaissance and humanist recovery and so forth, then Martin Luther brings all of this together. He steps forward heroically and out of concern for justification by faith, a man very carefully concerned with his conscience, with caring for the lives of other people and the eternal states of other people, then he steps out courageously and makes this choice. Someone provokes me with a picture of Luther as anti-Semitic, as a person who harshly calls for the deaths of peasants in the light of their revolt against their rulers. And so now I want to know which of those is actually the real Luther. Which of those is actually true? The Luther who sparks the Reformation and who is deeply conscience-led by the concern for truth, or the Luther who hates Jews and wants to see peasants killed under the right circumstances? Which one is true? And how does this historian come back to that properly?
Luther is a notorious difficult case. I would say Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther, Churchill, trying to think, Hitler, are kind of notorious. I group those together in the cross time periods and world more sides of the general moral equation there, as people who have been worked on numerous times by historians who come to radically different conclusions. My general, not being an expert in Luther, but someone who's done a little bit of work on Reformation, I would say both. One of the problems of history practice is things are invariably morally complicated. So as one digs into the circumstances of Martin Luther's life, you're going to find things that are difficult, as a Christian, difficult to handle. You're going to find someone's dirty laundry, as it were. You're going to find that people are often do the right things for sometimes good and wrong motives. There is a certain kind of, especially late in Luther's life, as I understand it, a certain amount of celebrity that he wrestles with. And I think you, as a Christian who's trying to practice history and a church historian, always need to be well grounded in facts and reality. We have, as a psychological bias, a way of whitewashing or a way of sanitizing things we don't want to see, things that are morally complex, or things that may kind of make our own personal confessional narrative maybe less clean. I can say, as a Christian who practices history, I look at the Renaissance and Reformation as historical realities I can say that God, I can say as a Christian that God had a hand in preserving his word, in bringing about a culture that valued learning and valued ancient languages, valued sources that helped preserve his word. I can see God's hand moving there, but I can't be very specific because God's word isn't specific. So I have to be very careful. I make a distinction between small t and big T truths. I know that God is going to do certain things, preserve his word, preserve the church, work through the church, but I have to be very careful when I, have my Christian glasses on. That sounds kind of trivial, but as I have my Christian glasses on, that I don't allow that to make me write bad history or color my thoughts. I think one of the I think when we were in graduate school together, one of the hot topics of the day was Hurricane Katrina hitting New Orleans. And here's this massive cyclone hurricane, devastating a city. There are a lot of things going on there, but one of the popular topics of the day was New Orleans is a city kind of known for, we'll say, loose morals. Has that reputation. There was a certain group of people, Christians, who wanted to say this is God's judgment on the city of New Orleans, and I frankly brushed at that a little bit. That was a difficult. I could say yes, God judges sin. I can say that someone's iniquity is going to. God punishes that, but I can't say on a broader scale that this specific moment is God's judgment on the city of New Orleans. And I can say that on reasonable grounds because, let's say, a city like, I'm being American centric here, but a city like Las Vegas, known for gambling and moral excess, hasn't been swallowed up by an earthquake, hasn't been burned to the ground. I think it's a difficult leap to make to say this is God's judgment. I'm sure God, in his permissive will, allowed this to happen. I mean, there's a number of clarifying remarks we can make. But as a Christian as a Christian historian, there were Christian historians who were trying to make that argument, and it was difficult to handle because we can't know exactly what God is doing. Once again, distinction between small t and large T truths. That I think became a problem. And
are you familiar with like Augustine and the kind of the tenet up behind City of God, which is this? It's very fascinating. It's this, but it's backwards, where he's explaining the fall of Rome, and he's answering apologetically why that's not because Rome had abandoned the gods. And so basically you've got it backwards, the shoe on the other foot, where pagans are saying it's because we abandoned the other gods and the Constantine, the conversion of Constantine, all that history. And so because of that, then that's why Rome got destroyed. And Augustine's coming back and saying, no, it has nothing to do with that. But it's this historical fallacy on the other foot where the pagans are doing it. Yeah. I think there's something, maybe I'm overstating it, but there is something a little bit pagan or a little bit over-realized confidence, overconfident epistemology or something. Anytime that we do look at current events and we say, like, this happened because of that, and the truth is you really just don't know. You really have no idea why it happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of Job a little bit. The book, Job essentially is one of the major moral quandaries of Job is the moral universe as he sees it doesn't add up. And God I'm wildly over summarizing here, but God essentially sits him down and says, it's not, the moral equation of the universe is mine. I control that. That's my job. You don't need to worry about that assigning judgment or kind of the moral fabric of the universe. You need to worry about fearing me. You need to essentially is what, look at me. Do I do bad things? No. Do I do things? Am I out of? No. God essentially sits Job down and says, you're not the moral arbiter of the universe, so stop trying. I mean, that's a wild over summary, but I think that's Christian historians can have tried to in the past be moral arbiters. And I think that's
Yeah.
a very difficult place to be from a just a critical historical perspective. And even as a Christian, we tend to want to know more. I mean, we always want to know more. We always want to, I guess the corollary evil there is we want to, yes, we want to call out as a Christian. We want to, when something's wrong, we want to say it's wrong. This doesn't lead to complete moral relativism, but I think we need to be careful that we aren't making ourselves moral arbiters of the universe.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fascinating because you're coming at it from a historical standpoint. I think I can come at it from a theological standpoint too, where I've got exegesis on this, where Jesus says, the tower that fell on those guys, do you think it was because they were more wicked than anybody else? And the answer is no, unless apart from the mercy of God, all of us are dead. I can definitively point at any tragedy and say that tragedy happened because of sin, by which I specifically mean that sin that happened back when Eve ate the fruit. All of this is a direct function of the curse. But as far as that city or that country or those people being any more wicked than anyone else, like, who am I to point the finger and decide that they are something more morally opprobrious than I? So let me go another direction. Here's something that you did a little while ago, and then we kept on moving. You were talking about, I asked you a question about Luther, and then there's a question about evaluating morally and ethically and how you look at someone like that. I'm going to make one comment that is putting this in relation to the theological side. I am fascinated, you did the historical side. I think I can do the same thing theologically to say, one of the reasons not to sanitize Luther or not to turn these people into heroes, like we so much tend to do, I think there are theological reasons to recognize that he's broken and that all of our, quote, heroes are broken. And what I discover that's so rich about it is when I go into the Bible, David, Abraham, I mean, I've got some of the key figures that are at the bedrock of our faith, and these people are broken. They do really, really awful things. And I think the Bible itself, as good history, is showing us that reality, as well as the bigger connection that, like, nobody, Luther, Abraham, David, or anyone else, was heroic because they were so good. They were just all broken, and it pretty much happened in spite of them. Any good that happened in spite of them. So I think I can put like a very strong theological grid into some of the same things that you're coming at historically. Any comment there?
Yes, I will concur with you. And I think another kind of historiographical note here, I once read, this was actually for class at Bob Jones, I read a biography of Luther written by a historian at University of Tennessee, kind of a well-known late career kind of book. And he essentially, in his preface, says, I'm addressing the topic of Luther to understand the relationship between the Christian worldview and violence, specifically evangelical support for the Vietnam War. And
incredible. Wow.
He's very overt about it, and he wants to. He kind of he picks out once again returning to the data set theme here. Takes the data set of Luther's life, and this is a massive tome, and picks out violence, conflict, and there are some perspective. He's using kind of a psychoanalytic idea. He's using some tools that are maybe a little bit more historically, graphically avant-garde. Maybe odd. Or cutting edge, as it were, and maybe a little frowned on these days. But he essentially he's taking that complex data set and doing something that's very interesting. I don't think the biography holds up well, but it's a way in which the practice of history tells us as much about the historian as it does about the topic at times. Especially in complicated situations like Luther. And I think we always need to, when we're doing history, and when we're trying to make histories, or when we are consuming history, we always need to keep that in mind. I'm bringing up a case like this case of Luther. It's the past is very complicated, and it's very difficult for us to say with the certainty that we would say, that we would use in the pulpit, or that we would use in expounding God's word. It's difficult to have that kind of certainty about the past. So the natural question for me is, why study the past? What use is there for history? And I will say this, I think you are or will have a conversation with Dr. Matsko about history, potentially. One of the anecdotes I remember from his class, or one of his classes, his brother is a chemist. And he's, anecdotally remarked in class that we all become historians, especially as we age. We look at the past, we try to make sense of it. And he finds that he was kind of remarking that his brother, a PhD in analytic chemistry, a very specific kind of, very, very accomplished chemist, has become more interested in history. And this is a natural kind of Christian and kind of a maturing aspect of human nature, I guess we can say, to try to do history and to think historically. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh man, I mean, there's some really interesting things there that pop in my mind. One of them is that I'm fascinated with is the unique biblical spin that you get on history with the whole remember motif. One of the theology guys did a dissertation on the remember motif, where across particularly the Mosaic, the first 5 books, across the Pentateuch, then you're having this constant remember, and then when you go forward, then call to mind, remember what I did for you. Particularly in the Exodus. So Israel's history in the event of the Exodus is core to their identity. That's a major motif. And then coming forward, of course, like Christianity is a profoundly, deeply historical faith that at the foundation, apart from, what certain critics have sought to do, like we have to believe, and we do strongly, deeply believe that these things did actually happen. And that fact that of event in time is core to what we believe. Another thing that kind of pops in my mind here, going from a theological standpoint, I wonder about Ecclesiastes and kind of a notion that as we reach the end of our lives, we're more self-aware of our mortality, where you start noticing, typically in the later part of their lives, people start paying attention to genealogies. They don't typically do that in their teens. Yeah. But, somehow when they're in their 60s and their 70s and they start getting really interested at times in who came before them, I've almost wondered at times, it's almost like a self-preservation thing a little bit. It's the sheer terror of recognizing that I as a human will probably not be remembered in any way. And remembering the people that came before me is almost a way of trying to preserve my own memory. And I think Ecclesiastes calls me to just say, like, no, of course you're not going to be remembered, but live well. But maybe that's even a piece of, as you come into another part of life, that you start thinking about some of these things. And then, of course, you just have more years of history that you're interested in, but you yourself have lived.
Well, I think if we can return to Luther for a second, I'm going to play kind of a little bit of, not devil's advocate, but if you were to hand Luther a copy of one of the biographies of him, would he? I mean, of course, he might have issues with a few things, but I think there's a certain way in which how we were remembered is a cartoon or a visit, is so different than what we think of ourselves, and maybe what we know to be true and not be true, and that's not something we can necessarily be concerned about, I guess. It's the truth as we see it of what happened, small t truth, is oftentimes by other people seen very differently. And that is a historiographer's problem, is that you're never going to understand everything. You can't get inside people's heads. So, the arguments you make about the past are as much about yourself sometimes. And I think that's sounding a little bit postmodern to say that, but I think to a large degree, history has wrestled with postmodernity pretty well. And I think also reasons that we would be interested in history as Christians are probably because our faith is historic. I mean, we are in the Old Testament is there so that we understand both context for the New Testament. It's not just the Old Testament is not just a precursor. There are, I think I remember, was it Dan Ollinger in one of my classes mentioned he was struggling in graduate school. One of our Bible professors was telling me that he was struggling with his faith in graduate school and reading through, I think it was one of the lists in Kings of genealogies, and he mentioned that he's struggling with his faith and he had this reading assignment for seminary, and he's like, lies, generally well constructed lies, avoid detail and extraneous detail, because that just complicates things. And he's looking at this extremely detailed list of people and it's like, this isn't a well made up lie. This is good source material. I think to a certain degree, there are the Old Testament is good history. I think it's difficult because we see God as the author. It's difficult to hold it up as a historical model, because we have the moral arbiter of the universe writing it. So that lends it. God can use a story. I'm thinking of Eli and his sons at the very end, where there are certain details about his sight and his fatness that are there to kind of give hints about how he has morally developed over the years, and that he has become sloppy. He has lost a moral vision and does not see the sin of his sons. Those are some notes that I think God leaves us because he sees more than we see. It'd be difficult for a historian to kind of make those same, a church historian or a secular historian or a Christian secular historian, to make those same anecdotes or make those same kind of observations with the same clarity that God does. But I think I think there's a certain amount of use in thinking about the Old Testament history as a way of as identity formation. I think it's also a way in which we see mistakes that have been made. We see how things have gone wrong. It's more of what not to do. I remember, I think the Siege of Munster is a really good kind of church history case study. It's a situation where it's a late Reformation, radicals take over the city, begin to kind of impose doctrinal and confessional norms upon a city. And essentially the secular prince regent has to come in, besiege the city, and execute a number of the, I wouldn't say cult members, as a way of reasserting the political authority. And I think it's a way of understanding how dogmatism outside of scripture can have devastating effects. I think it's another way, it's a way of thinking about mistakes that people in the name of, I'm using Christian in quotes here, Christianity has made. So history is a way in which we kind of look at what other people have done and maybe avoid some of those same mistakes. It also can be a means of inspiration, and a way of contextualizing what's going on. I'm reminded of, I was thinking about Asian, maybe trying to find some Asian examples, maybe Eric Liddell. Are you familiar with that particular story?
Yeah, go ahead now.
How history might be useful for Christians is this is, a Christian missionary in China, famously refuses to run in the Olympics. I think it's the 24 games, in the 100-meter dash, because the trials are held on Sunday. He subsequently wins a gold and a bronze in other events that he wasn't particularly well trained for. We typically find, little Christian biographies of him that are inspiring, but I think it's also, as a Christian who is interested in history, necessary to look into the context to understand why a missionary is in China in that particular time period. I remember having a conversation with a historian at Duke who does missions. Her she's a I would consider a very sharp, bright historian. She does have a Christian background. I don't know her specific faith commitments, but she's been a historian of British missions, and over the years has done some work on David Livingstone in Africa, and history then becomes a way in which we understand how God may use secular events. But I think it's very difficult how to use secular events like the colonization of Africa, things that are generally morally complicated. And missionaries have had license to go places where perhaps they would not have been able to otherwise. And that's something we can as Christians can see good, how God maybe uses good, or uses bad circumstances to accomplish some good things. I would say the general legacy of colonization in Africa is a very negative thing. But in spite of this moral complexity, God has been able to fashion something good. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's where I think the more robust reality of understanding these in their context and the moral complexity of these things, where one layer of, let's say, viewing David Livingstone or viewing this era is to go ahead and sanitize these stories, take all the moral ambiguity out of it, make the guy heroic, make everything about it heroic, and so everything works out. It kind of like all plays out in it to a good story. And in another way, I think grappling with the moral twistedness of some of these realities in the era and things that were happening that were messed up on a deep, deep level actually helps me think about life today better. And if we could get the real stories, they don't read as well. But when I actually read, like, I'm thinking of, let's see, Wesley, Whitfield. And like, even better than Wesley, Whitfield was generally a very laudable character. But when he comes over here, when he comes over to, I'm not in the U.S. anymore. When he came over to the U.S., I didn't know that. When he went over and he sets up his colony in Georgia, at some point he's in support of slavery. And it has to do with some complexities about the way that his orphanage is set up in Georgia. So, I mean, it's just messy. But I think once I recognize some of that, and I'm willing to grapple or recognize and admit it to myself, then when I come back around to real life, history sounds a lot more real. It sounds more like the world I live in. It actually sounds like something I can connect with, and therefore my time doesn't sound so odd in connection with all these wonderful stories that I've heard.
Yeah. I think you make a good point there. There's a certain amount of, going back to moral complexity, we need to judge him by his own time period standards, and I would say by our own standards as well. There's an impulse that we have to judge everyone exactly by their specific historical moment. And this might be a slight distinction between when we say church history or confessional histories, and secular historians. A secular historian, for instance, let's do Robert E. Lee. Is another really difficult case to deal with. Does good things after fighting a war in support of slavery. This is really kind of morally ambiguous. I mean, there's all kinds of political divides on how to interpret Lee, and some really long, gnarly history debates, arguments about how to deal with Lee. The moral complexity of his life. And some historians will say we can only judge him by his time period standards. He would have not understood human rights the same way that someone post-Geneva Convention would understand human rights. Or even, did he have a deep understanding of Locke? Maybe, and some of the arguments for generalized human rights. But I can also say he had a Bible, and reported to read it, quotes it. Should have had access to information about how to treat one's neighbor, regardless of race. how to navigate political complexities. Specifically, what allegiance do you owe to Caesar, and what allegiance do you owe to your God? That I think have to color a Christian's interpretation of Lee that perhaps a secular historian might not have. And a good secular historian will attempt to jump into Lee's confessional context, understand his church, understand his context, and judge him by those standards. But I think certainly we have to lay some more moral blame on Lee because he is a professing believer who does some things that are at best morally difficult to handle. And I think actually Dr. Matsko is somewhat of an expert on some Lee issues in that regard. We may differ on that. But I think this is an interesting kind of case study where a Christian historian, who reads a biography of Lee and gets invested in Lee's story may come to some different conclusions than a secular historian of Lee. I think we can have a little bit more moral insight, but it's limited in that regard. Does that make sense? I started to jump from Whitefield to Lee.
No, that's good. Here's another layer that just makes it really vexing or complex is, so if you go back to this era, the people that are actually arguing on the Southern side, the pro-slavery side, theologically, a lot of these guys are the ones that I would be most aligned with in other areas of theology. In other words, they're the conservatives. And the people who are arguing against slavery tend to be the theological liberals. So the people that I'm on track with when it comes to basic issues of like criticism and accepting the biblical text went off in this one area. And that takes me into this question that you were just raising, which is how do I evaluate moral standards, or how do I view, morally speaking, what they were doing? Do I judge them by the standards of their day and their context and their culture and how their culture was controlling the way they thought about stuff? And I like what you said. I do, except as a biblical Christian, I also believe that there are absolute ethics that are unchanging, and they also have to be judged by those. So I understand their ethics, and in a certain sense, I say Dabney, he wasn't trying to be a jerk. I really think Dabney was one of these conservative theologians. I really think he was trying to understand the Bible. I really do. And I really think his culture affected the way he thought about it. And I really do think that he was wrong. But I don't think that he was trying to be a bad guy. I just think that something about his culture twisted his thinking on this particular point. So I can maintain both at the same time in a certain sense, recognizing the reality of his day, but ultimately judging him by standards of morals that don't change, that are universal.
Yeah, I think there's something you said reminds me of a specific historical case study that tends to show up in a lot of undergraduate historiography classes or history writing classes. It's kind of a famous problem. There's a French historian who wrote about a massacre of cats. And it's funny. There's something to be learned from Western attitudes towards cats. He somewhat tongue in cheek. There's a history of how society has interacted with cats. Ancient Egypt, these things are revered. And placed in the tomb with the dead pharaoh to accompany him to the great beyond. Lo and about 17th, 18th century, cats are slaughtered in mass because cats are evil. They carry with them bad omens, or they're considered unclean. Never mind the rats. And it's morally justified to slaughter them in mass, and that's what he's focusing on, this moment where cats are slaughtered in mass. And then fast forward to today, his contemporary time, in which cats are household pets. We spend a great deal of time, effort, manicuring the claws, and ordering our living spaces to give the cat maximum satisfaction, which is its own kind of micro history of Western society, and opulence, as it were. The historian points out that our moral attitude towards cats changes over time. How we view these creatures has a history. So one thing historians are today to emphasize is everything has a history. There is a change over time constantly, and that's what historians are always gauging, change over time. And what changes, what doesn't change, is there's continuity within that change. But the moral conditions, it is the morally right thing to do to slaughter these cats, and why we slaughter them, and what's going on, and in a different moral context or different historical context, it's the morally right thing to place them into the tomb with the dead pharaoh. And I know we're jumping cultures and time periods, but there is a narrative that can be made about cats and their relationship to Western society, but also a way in which we have to the moral standards at each individual moment mean the historical actors act differently, and it's complicated to understand what's going on. It tells us a lot about the assumptions of any given culture or any given time or moment, and ways in which historians have a lot of work to do. History is not easy. Theology isn't easy. History is not easy. It's very difficult to especially write academic histories, because one has to wrestle with what other people have said about it, what makes your claims different than theirs, and then ultimately try to make it fit into something that a reader can digest. Histories are often, when you mentioned heroic, that's a historically loaded term, very often used, a century or two ago. Histories were, very much in the Homeric model, triumphalist Western narratives. Even Churchill is, a famous history of himself, or history of the English people. It's inevitable. The triumph in World War II is the inevitable, climax of all things British up until this point. And that's fallen way out of favor. That's very, very Western, very cliche, not real supported by facts, because one can simply select the facts that support that. Never mind the losses in India, never mind the colossal failures of moral compass during the Opium Wars, never mind what happened in South Africa. Those are traditionally very Western viewpoints. And I think also someone informed by maybe, a classical tradition, a cartoon version of a classical tradition they're trying to copy, to make an argument about British society. And I think that's problematic on a number of levels. But I think we need to avoid that same kind of fallacy when doing church history, that triumphs are inevitable, that the moral arc of, I'm going to borrow a contemporary, the moral arc of the universe bends towards a specific conclusion, because outside of scripture, that's a very difficult argument to make. And even within scripture, that's a hotly contested topic, as you might well know. If you want to start a fight, talk eschatology.
Very interesting concepts going around in there. Yeah. So, this is like maybe a year ago. So I finished a history of Genghis Khan and the Mongol people. And so the last chapter of it was the best part, because he traces how Genghis Khan has, and it's been a number of years since Genghis passed away, how Genghis has risen and fallen over history. And basically you go ahead another 50 years and he's positive, go another another 100 years, he's bad, he's horrible, he's terrible, he brought everything, all the worst, and then you get a little further and, well, maybe not so much. And it goes up and down, so that even an individual person who's already lived and died and it's done, in a sense, it's not done. Because history is still going to bring them ups and downs as the present milieu changes, and people want to twist the understanding of who that person was to fit their own personal agendas. Can I do like one or two topics before we finish off, because we're going to take a break in a few minutes? Okay, so I'm going to give some examples here, like what would strike me as positive uses of history, and negative. And I'll start with the negative. So what I would view as odd examples or bad examples of church history, I'm really uncomfortable with an idea like, let's say, the defeat of the Spanish Armada was to ensure Protestantism for Britain, the US, and the nations influenced by it, and so forth. In other words, the Spanish Armada went down because of a providential intention going on there. I think actually there's some really interesting stuff going on about like the structure of the Spanish army and the way that they set up their ships and armaments and their guns and the structure, the organizational structure, military and so forth. I mean, there's some really fascinating stuff. I can say providentially God used it, but I think God still could have gotten his job done if the Spanish Armada had won. I'll keep on going. I'll give a couple examples. I'm going to ask you, get your feedback. So let's say the Cold War. Okay, go ahead. Let's hear it.
This is an actually known historiographical problem. We call it the Protestant wind. Weather intervenes in the Spanish Armada that it is an advantage to the English. I think there's a fog and a wind, and the English sees on this as God's providential backing of their Anglican, Protestant viewpoint. Historically speaking, military history is often beset by this kind of decisive battle mentality. Lee at Gettysburg, or Lee and Meade at Gettysburg. If Lee had just done this, then the entire history of the war would have changed. No. We often kind of look for decisive moments and not realize that historically speaking, these moments are often products of processes that are much larger. The economic advantage the North enjoyed during the Civil War meant victory was inevitable, literally. Lee was last gasp. If he had won at Gettysburg, he probably would have lost at Harrisburg, the next battle, just because of the supply. So I think just interject real quickly there, would probably, the outcomes contingency, if this had happened, then this, counterfactual arguments are very difficult to make. And there is a discipline of counterfactual history that I find deeply weird. I think God does use that event. There are ways in which, but God doesn't have to use that event. And to see everything is contingent on one moment, oftentimes ignores a lot of other evidence. So,
Right, or counterexamples. Some other time when you have a major battle that kind of goes like the other way, and we just move on from those. Okay, so I do that, but then let me go the other direction. Given my theological pre-commitments, I do sign up for an idea, something like the Messiah came, Jesus came at the perfect time for the easy spread of the gospel all across Europe, Northern Africa, Western Asia. And I do that, there is some historiographical stuff going on, but I feel like Galatians 4:4 in the fullness of time, and then just the nature of how all the pieces come together. I do believe confidently that God could have gotten his word spread had there not been a Roman Empire with good roads and peace and stability and so forth. So I'm not dependent on that per se, but I think I can still fit that data point in enough that I go ahead and buy it. Do you? How does it hit you?
I go ahead. I go ahead and buy it, but I guess the fullness probably entails more than just historical reality or perceived reality, or things that we can know. I think there's good biblical evidence to say there's more going on than we perceive. With our eyes, ears, and so there's a reality there we just don't have access to. Also, because the Bible says it makes that argument, I buy into it. But I think from the historical evidence is a good support or way of clarifying. But only the Bible, we can say did the fullness of time exist when Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the wall, right? Yes and no. There are deep theological movements in multiple countries at that time that echo what Luther's doing. The fact Luther kind of gets the credit for it is because the specific match he struck happened to light a flame. And we happen to have a lot of good sources on Luther. There are other people we don't have good sources on who came before him and influence people around him. We don't know. His second cousin may have, handed him a manuscript, handed him a tract, handed him a Protestant tract, and we just don't know it because he never referenced it. So there's a kind of in the same way military history suffers from the decisive battle syndrome, church history or Christian narratives might also suffer from that same kind of fallacy that, if Luther hadn't done this, then we wouldn't have had, there were other support structures in place. There were other movements. I referenced, illiterate English country, farmers who had entire books of chapters and books of the Bible memorized. I think the specific translation is the Wycliffe Bible. I think segments of the Wycliffe Bible are quoted in court cases, in English county court cases, where someone's brought up on heresy and they're able to quote, illiterate people are able to quote whole sections of the scriptures. And there's just not a good historical explanation for this other than there are unheralded lollards going throughout people who don't have good documentation going throughout the English countryside, reciting scripture in public gathering houses. And there's, we don't have good sources on it. So
that's awesome. Certainly, that's really fascinating. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So it's there's certainly more going on than we ever can know. And that's the historian's problem, is there are things we just can't know. So.
All right, let me ask you one more,
Sure.
And then we got to take a break. So I've picked up biographies before. I mentioned one of them to you. It was a biography, pretty recent biography of Bonhoeffer. I've picked up biographies before, and I started into them, and I quit because it gave me this strong sense that something was being sanitized or something about the story wasn't smelling right. I've picked up other biographies. When it comes to mind, Arnold Dallimore, I don't know if you've done anything with him. I've picked up others that I really, as I'm reading, I'm feeling like this guy is coming from a dogmatic standpoint, but he is giving me the full picture. I really feel like I'm learning more of what was actually going on. I don't feel sanitized. It doesn't feel sanitized. Give me a couple of 2 or 3 things that come to mind that as a historian, you kind of sniff something's foul. When you pick up history that doesn't smell right, what are some of the things that are hallmarks of that or signs that point you in that direction?
Okay, so I'm going to I'll lay out a few things. If first of all, if it's neat and clean, in the sense that it reads like a novel. If the conclusion or the apex of events, if it's a narrative, neatly fits together, that's a sign that we haven't marshaled our sources well. And that brings up some red flags. If it's too clear, the conclusion is inevitable. Or like I said, the decisive battle syndrome would be a symptom of that. Also, if it's not morally complicated. So I think the Bonhoeffer biography you reference is actually on my shelf. I have not read it for those reasons. It was loaned to me. Oh, you should read this book because it tells me if it fits neatly with our confessional narrative, if the history just kind of, it's meant to please a certain audience, and sell books. I would also say, anything that, it smells bad. Yeah, there's a certain lack of I guess when it comes to food, there's a good food metaphor here. I'm cooking up in my head. Pardon the pun. As one consumes history, you get a certain flavor for time periods, and if something just doesn't seem to fit, if something just it doesn't mesh well with what you know to be true, and or I hesitate to use academic consensus because there are revisions. History will go through revision cycles. So, we may have a dominant narrative about causes for the Civil War, the American Civil War, or World War II. And then someone will come by and revise that. But if there's an outlier, if someone is writing a book that just doesn't fit with what anyone else has done with this subject before, it could be a genuinely revolution in the field. New evidence, new things have come to light, but generally that's not the case. I think there's a good example. There's a book written, and we talked a good deal about it in one of Dr. Matsko's classes. And actually, the gentleman who wrote the book was on the dissertation committee for one of the faculty members of Bob Jones at Emory University. He writes a book about gun culture in colonial America, and he argues that there aren't guns in people's wills. You know, the you know, when colonial settlers pass on their goods to their children after they die, you know, there aren't guns being, you know, willed to relatives, and these aren't part of people's, you know, insurance manifests and things like that. So he argues that the Second Amendment, which is a contested area of the American Constitution that seems to grant, you know, that grants or mentions gun ownership, I'm summarizing there, is to be reinterpreted, and that gun culture isn't what we say it is and understand it to be historically. That in fact, the records prove there weren't that many guns. This was hailed as a radical discovery. He won awards. He was given tenure early as an academic historian at a major research at Emory, major research institution. What happens then is graduate students pile into his sources and into his citations and begin to find problems. He falsified some of his documentation. He seems to have lost a good deal of his notes from in a flood. A convenient flood in his office destroyed some of his notes. Some of the records seem to have never existed at all. Some of the records he's citing, the repositories and libraries that he's referencing, say those records never existed, or we have no record of them ever existing, which, despite how well organized libraries are, things do slip through the cracks. A friend of mine worked at the Princeton Library, and he said they were bequeathed the it's not Faulkner, major American writer from the 20th century. I'm gonna Hemingway. They were bequeathed Hemingway's estate, and they're literally picking through boxes of Hemingway's used trousers and socks. You know, there are things in archives that just, you know, why is that there? And they may not know even what they have in cases. You know, here's an old box of old stuff, but he falsified it. He made it up. Is essentially what it comes down to. And what the sniff test, we call it, this doesn't smell right, flagged a lot of people, but because he seemed to have evidence, we accepted the thesis as revolutionary, but it didn't fit with the general narrative, what we knew to be true and academic consensus. And he's since been detenured for fraud. And that's a case in which knowing your time period, knowing the sources, being familiar with it, something didn't fit. This didn't seem to fit, and it comes with knowledge, skepticism, a natural skepticism the discipline has, and just kind of knowing this didn't a certain his sense, I guess not a sixth sense, but a certain kind of understanding of the time period. This just didn't fit. So
that's a very helpful anecdote. Yeah. Let me toss two more at you, and does this sound? They may just be different forms of what you've just said. If I find somebody who never encounters tensions in the data, like he never comes to a point where he says, here's a view, but here's another view, and between these two views, here's where I side, and yet I can understand, or in other words, it's like everything always is just like clear, absolutely clear, 100%. That makes me suspicious. And if it doesn't actually sound like the real world, where like somebody is so heroic, or they're such an incredible missionary, or they were such an incredible pastor or an incredible teacher. I'm like, I don't know that I've ever met anybody who is even 30% of that. I kind of start to wonder, like, are there any humans that are quite that heroic? Where basically every human I've ever known has foibles. And if there are no foibles, I'm really questioning whether this was actually a human or whether this was the thing you invented. Anything you want to say there?
Yeah. Oh, that's definitely true. If it seems more out of, like, I don't know, Homer's Odyssey, you know, in levels of heroicism or Iliad, then one needs to kind of acquire other perspectives. I think a general historical, if one wants to be historically grounded, read people you disagree with. So make sure one's reading is, or one's history consumption is multiple different viewpoints. So read an academic historian, as much as that kind of sometimes maybe a difficult slog, or complicated. Read a Marxist. Find someone who you know you don't agree with. I find tools of that. I know a few Marxists. I know tools they used have helped me understand a time period that maybe fit better than others. But read someone you know you have ideological differences with, just to see what you don't see. So try to acquire someone else's vision of a topic, and I think that might help clarify and help understand what your own biases are, and what your own culture, the limitations of your own culture. So I think that's something Western history has really suffered from, as we go tell stories about India, for example. That Indian historians, I know an Indian who is a historian of India and practices, academic history at an institution here in Ohio. Just look, you don't understand us. That's one of my roles, is trying to help, white English speakers to clarify their arguments and understand us on our own terms. There's a general trope in Russian history that there are levels of understanding, just varying degrees of misunderstanding, and a good history of Russia will have less misunderstanding, and that's generally true about a lot of topics. We try to clarify some of the misunderstandings and hopefully produce less misunderstanding.
Fabulous. Yeah, great. I got to cut us off because we're 15 minutes over our break time. Okay. David, thank you. This is great. This is very stimulating. Anyway, just making us think through the nature of the historical task and the complications thereof. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Very stimulating. Very much enjoyed it.
Real quick before you leave, if there are any questions you want me to clarify, feel free to shoot those to me in an email, and I'll try to clarify.
Will do. Anyone anywhere on here, if you have a question, shoot that to me in the break, and I will do that very thing. Thank you. Thank you for that offer. Thank you for your time. Very much appreciated.
Glad I could help.
Absolutely. All right. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss a couple more topics, kind of building off of some of what we've just discussed, and then go from there. So thank you. We'll see you all in about 5 minutes. I'm going to take some thoughts here, building a little bit off of what we just talked about with come from that. And actually, this is perfect. Brother Zentan Leon asked here below in one of the chat questions, what would be the most distinctive characteristics on history? It's an excellent question. It really nails something here. And this is precisely something I wanted to discuss a little bit. I see a note that I might be breaking. I apologize for that. If others are able to verify yes or no, but I apologize for any delays that are there. I'm not. Try one thing. There's a small chance this might help. Okay. So there's a fascinating question, which is, to what extent do we understand history theologically a little differently? And to what extent do we understand it differently because of our theological foundation? And what I mean by that is, a secular historian comes into the discussion and he has certain canons or certain methods that he assumes in how he understands or thinks about history. And we would have other viewpoints on some of these things coming from a specifically dogmatic standpoint. Of that, let me give some background. If you go way back in history, or the history of writing history, now we're layering on top, the history of doing history, there's a period when people are doing history only from a theological perspective. Okay. Subsequently, we come into the Enlightenment through criticism, historical criticism and so forth, are actually suggesting that the biblical viewpoint on history is all completely wrong. And so here's the proper method of doing history, the scientific method of doing history. And they're providing certain canons or certain methods history scientifically. You hit postmodernism and the postmodern turn, and the result of the postmodern turn is that now people are saying everybody injects a little bit of themselves into the way they do history, so that when you or I or someone else does history, we're doing it from the perspective of a person in the Philippines, a person in the US, a thing of ourselves into the way that we're doing history. That's part of the total equation. Okay. And the final result in that string, that progression, okay, is that today, self-consciously and even intentionally inject some of their perspective into the way they do history. The irony is to do it from a dogmatic or a religious perspective. You can't do. You're allowed to do it from the other perspectives, just not the religious one, is kind of the way that this can tend to function. And I want to kick back a little bit. I want to argue that on the contrary, we intentionally and self-consciously do our history in a theologically founded way. In general, I want to follow the same rules and canons that the historical process does at large, but there will be aspects and a little bit like coming at it from a doctrinal or biblical standpoint. Kenneth Chung, I'm just looking at your question here. A bit of or whose history are we talking about? And clarify the question a little bit so I know how to answer better. I'm not quite sure. Are you wondering about who's doing the history or the history of whom? About the subject of the history. Okay, good. Talking about history in general, about history all the way from the Babylonians to Luther to the history of the Southern Baptist Convention and their choice to fire Page Patterson. I talked about all of that history, and there are a couple of points where our way of doing history will be slightly different. Page Patterson was the one they fired, just in answer to the chat question here. One of the ways that it's going to, we self-confessedly, or we recognize that we have a teleology to our history. In other words, we do believe that there is a direction history is going, that somewhere, and there's purpose. This is a long question, and lots of discussions and lots of viewpoints could be represented here. So let's say Marxism and in some ways rested on the foundation of the history building towards something. History is getting better, and reality itself is improving. Or you can just put this in an evolutionary framework that is part of our secular today. People assuming that humanity itself and society itself is improving over time. Okay. Now, that viewpoint, which is broken, we reject. Yet, in other words, we do view that there is a point in history, there is a purpose, and it is going somewhere. We're not, or I'm not anyway, I'm not post-millennial, so I'm not believing that history gets better, but I am believing that history goes somewhere. I am believing that there is a purpose, and across the whole span of history, then Old Testament filled in Jesus, the fulfillment in Jesus, then bringing about a new reality, a new humanity, the church. And in the subsequent centuries of the church, then, in God's word, God's preserving his church. In other words, there was never a chance that the church would cease to exist and just vanish from the earth. So I knew that the church would exist, or the church had. Finally, coming forward even further, the confidence, the faith, to say that ultimately all things will end somewhere, that at the end of time, Jesus reigns, that at the end of time, there is a great period of destruction and decay. I believe that is premillennialist, there is a lot of chaos that happens, but following the chaos, there is ultimate order because Jesus is king over all. Okay, so as a person towards the past history, I do believe, and I have to believe, that there is a purpose, there is somewhere that it's going, and there is teleology to history. It's not, put it in these terms, random, it's not chaos, and it just keeps on going, no purpose and no end. Any feedback or any comments that we would have there, one way or another? I see Brother John Glass, you just commented, isn't there a great danger in perspective? Any feedback you want to give there, or further kind of building that thought out, so that I know how to interact with that, or any other further thoughts? Anyone that would have a piece of feedback there? It's the tension that I want to maintain. Okay, and I'm going to go this direction. How do I identify, though, where I see that happening? Okay, and so one expression of this would be, let's say, Israel 1948, the establishment. Does that represent that we are getting close to the end? Does that represent the fact that history has progressed up to this point? And now, because the nation state of Israel exists, I know definitively there is some type of progression. And I want to say, I believe absolutely and dogmatically that there is progression, but I can't necessarily identify what or when or in what progression is. I have to back off a little bit of identifying what the progression is, even though I definitively maintain very strongly that there is progression, that it does exist. So I think that probably fits what you're just saying as far as the tension there, the danger, the potential danger that could be there. I'm getting a little comments here that I'm having trouble with my feed. I'm going to try, and we'll just see how it goes. I'll try switching my method, and this may help or it may not. Give me a second. Okay, can you hear me on the other end, or any other feedback from anyone else, just to confirm that you're hearing me? Okay, I'm seeing some feeds come on here, so maybe this will be better for a little bit. Actually, part of what makes our historiography different, or maybe in a little certain sense, even deeper and fundamental, more fundamental and more profound, we point on history is one of the grandest, all-encompassing explanations for history at large, because we have a faith that is rooted on history, Jesus' birth and death and his historical resurrection, and that culminates and brings all of history together, and arguably is one of the grand schemes in terms of historical thought, that our view together under Jesus' headship. Okay, so I actually want to argue that ours is one of the most bold, grand historical themes, one of the boldest themes that points towards a purpose in history, possibly more than any other. A couple of, or one or two other places that we would be different than historical thought at all, at large, or the historical curriculum in general. We actually have points of defined and inspired history. So I have certain points of history where I can definitively say, for instance, that God was involved in the rise and the fall of Israel. God was involved in Cyrus. God was involved in the exile. God was involved in Cyrus' decree and the Cyrus cylinder to send people back. God was directly involved in Babylon, Persia, Greece, Certainly God was directly involved in the ultimate single most influential individual in the history of the world, Jesus. And I can say that both from theological basis and from historical basis. I think there's a pretty good case to be made that Jesus has had more influence on world history, certainly the last 2,000 years of it, than historians will sign up for that, okay? And historically then, or biblically, we say that God was behind all of that, and I can know that that's true. Okay, that's a pretty bold assertion. And a historian, secular historian, would back off of that, okay? But we end up saying that with confidence. So that's yet another point where we're going to be different. And then finally, the last that I'll mention here would be, actually, there are two more. We are going to be a little different on our morals. In other words, in our ethical evaluations, we're going to go ahead and step forward and say certain things were right and wrong. And we're going to be fairly definitive about doing that. Where a secular historian will say, well, you've got to judge the person off the morals of their time. And in some cases, then, morals or ethics are just defined by the scenario or the person or the culture or the time. And we come back and say there is absolute ethics, there is right or wrong that transcend time. To be fair and to be honest about it, the time of a historian or an individual in the past, but it also evaluates my own time. And so I'm blind to a bunch of things myself about my own thinking because my own culture has blinded me. And biblical truth transcends me also, critiques me, corrects me. Give it a couple of hundred years and some historian down the line will look back on our era and recognize some blind spots. But biblical ethics transcends all of that, and it's a much bigger picture. Okay, and then the last thing, I would argue that though as coming with a dogmatic framework or an absolute framework for how we think about history, even though we have that viewpoint and we can point to certain things and say God did that because in his word he tells us he did that, I would suggest as biblical historians, we, if anything, ought to be even more reluctant to make absolute statements and evaluations about things that are outside of the scope of biblical revelation. And I have some reasons for that. Ecclesiastes, a man cannot know the end from the beginning. I would argue that when you look at all the prophecies of the Old Testament, all pointing towards Jesus, they're all there, okay? But the Jewish people missed that. The experts missed that, even though that information was there. At the end, Acts 1, after the disciples have been with Jesus for 30 years, they still don't get it. They still don't get what's going to happen next, okay? And I think all of those things are pointing us to say human beings in general and theologians even can be really, really bad judges of putting all the pieces together and figuring it out. So the truth is, I ought to be epistemologically self-questioning about looking at things post the book of Acts, after biblical revelation, and definitively saying this is that, or I know why this happened and it's because of that. If anything, we're probably going to need to be more careful, possibly even than a secular historian would. We have to believe that divine and natural causes are generally coextensive. In other words, when something happens, God is working through that always. Okay? The problem is I just don't know what that means. I don't know if his intention is going that way, somewhere else. He has intentions that are so much bigger. And some of this would go back to Ecclesiastes in the book of Job. So sovereignty of God, I confidently assert everything that happens, God is working through. And simultaneously, I confidently assert, I have no idea what those purposes are. And I think biblical faith draws me or drives me in both of those directions at the same time. I'm going to just interact with a couple of questions that we have here. So John Glass, on the other hand, we're in the middle, the already not yet. The Bible history is past and clear. The current time is lumped in one huge statement last times. So good. I totally agree with that. And Brother Zamtan Lian, the invisible hand behind the wheel of histories of world history. And I think that's correct. He made a good point here like this too, and I forgot, I meant to add this in here as a difference. One other difference point between a biblical or dogmatic, what we would call dogmatic framework for doing history versus a secular history, would certainly be our view of beginnings. So you're going to have a whole massive section of secular histories. Technically, they're prehistory, because what they're dealing with is it's information that's before these things are starting to be written down, outside of the biblical record. But they're doing it through other artifacts and other forms of record. And they're trying to do like geological history. They're trying to go back, in this case is hundreds of thousands or millions of years, to say what happened before mankind started self-consciously recording those things. We have a very different view of that, because we actually believe that we have a written record of history from the very beginning. And so the first part of most secular histories I found very unhelpful, because I feel like they completely got it wrong. Well, my dogmatic viewpoint, my religious viewpoint, my faith viewpoint is what drives me to go differently than they. And that's where that difference arises. Okay, that's all I'm going to do here as far as this particular discussion. Any comments back? Anything that we want to discuss further here? Because if not, what I want to do is I need to do two things. I want to introduce a book to you. I prepared actually, I ended up with too much information. There's a good hour and a half to 2 hours worth of content in it. We're just not even going to go into it. I'm hoping to cover it in a future lecture. But I want to introduce the book to you, and then I want to encourage you to take a look at it, because if you do, I think you'll find it extremely helpful. But just before I do that, let me jump over and show you some of the lectures that are coming up in the near future. So I'm going to pull up here the syllabus, and I want you to see the next lecture. This is going to be Jason Armstrong, or Dr. Jason Armstrong's lecture for our next time. And I will go ahead and put the homework up for that immediately after. So right after we're done here, just a brief moment. Right after we're done here, you can be able to pull up this information, and I would ask you to do your readings before the lecture for next time if you can. He'll be covering baptism and the church fathers, which will be this will be an really interesting topic. I think we'll be definitely engaged by. So that's his next lecture, and I'll strongly encourage you to do your homework before next time, because that's going to help us have that discussion more profitably. Next, after that, is Dr. John Matsko. He's a PhD, earned PhD in history. He teaches the historiography classes. He was the chair of the history department, and I think he just recently retired. But so he's the representative, or one of the major theologians at BJU, and he's agreed to do a lecture for us just talking about historiography and the nature of historical research. I was elated when he agreed to do that lecture for us. So anyway, definitely let's be there for that one. It'd be a very engaging lecture. Dr. Threlfall he's just a recent grad, as in a month ago, graduated from Southern Seminary, and that was in apologetics and worldview, but he's doing the long shadow of Augustine. Augustine has an incredibly outsized influence stretching across church history. And so a key part of understanding church history is understanding Augustine, followed by Dr. Patterson. These are just here at this time because of his schedule. I would have been happy to put them later on, because both of these are later eras, but we fit them in there where we can. Dr. Collins with medieval Christianity, Dr. C.J. Harris, missions in the Reformation era. I'm working on Dr. Mark Sidwell. He's offered to do a lecture, and so we're working through the topics for these, and those aren't filled in yet. Dr. Brent Cook did his dissertation on Baptist successionism, landmarkism, and he'll be dealing with that. And then we finished out last year. You can see the following lectures there. So this is the progression of how the lecture, or how the flow of thought looks as we get through the remaining lectures. Here is my rationale just for how we're doing this class and how it's set up. I am not doing this as a section by section, era by era discussion. In other words, let's cover the ante-Nicene fathers and the Nicene and post-Nicene, and then we go forward. I'm not, early medieval era and so forth. I'm not doing it that way, period by period, and I'm not doing it that way intentionally because we can't really accurately cover all of that in one semester. That should be a 2-semester class, and even then, it would be flying too fast to really cover all the content. Okay. The assumption, however, is by the time you're taking an advanced level class, we're hoping that you've already taken a master's level church history introduction type class, a 1 or 2 semester church history type class. That's typically part of a MDiv curriculum or even a Master's of Arts curriculum. A lot of times we'll at least have 1 semester or 2 semesters of church history. Okay, that's an assumption we're making though, because you may or may not have had. You have. What we are trying to do here is that instead covering the big picture, we're getting the whole scope of history about church history, particularly some of the textbooks that I offered in the syllabus. Okay, so if you scroll down further in the syllabus that I sent you, I gave you a couple of recommendations. The History of Christianity it's delightful. It's fantastic reading. It's really, really engaging and fun. And if I was going to pick any, I would say the first volume. Okay, the first volume of History of Christianity. The problem is, after about the Reformation, he starts to show that he's a liberal. I say he's a liberal. Well, he is. He's United Methodist. He starts to show that he's very much thinking in terms of ecumenism and in some viewpoints that we would not buy into. And so volume, it gets less productive. So I would strongly encourage the first volume of History of Christianity, and maybe the first half of the second volume, getting through the Reformation and so forth. It's when you get after that, you're going to see increasingly some things in the, let's say, the last 200 years, that era, that aren't going to be as. That's where other resources could potentially pick up the slack for you. Lauderette is not. It's not the most engaging reading in the world. It's actually kind of sloggy reading, but it's and it's good. It's an option. And then also some of these other options here, they're workable enough. Okay, but our rationale here is from outside reading. And that then what's going to happen in these lectures is you're going to see different topics where somebody's going deep. Okay, you get your overall coverage from your own reading, but in these lectures, somebody takes a topic like baptism and the church fathers and just sinks. And the rationale of that is we want you to see, okay, a person that does it well, who really knows his stuff in this particular area because he's done a dissertation or massive research in it. This is how you do it, and this is how you do it well. So you're going to see each one of these more like topical streams that are going through church history in general or through a particular era of church history and just center. Any feedback or commentary or any interaction we want to have there as far as the rationale of the class and where we're going. Okay, one other thing, and this will, I think, basically finish out our time for tonight. I want to show you a resource that I started working on today. I spent a lot of time working this resource because I wanted to share it with you. And anyway, we don't have time. But I'm going to pull it up here. And I want to encourage you. This resource, if willing to give it a shot. I think this might actually be a really good way for you to get an overall picture of church history. Just this, okay? And what I'm going to give you here, it's Justo Gonzalez, which I just mentioned him, History of Christianity. But it's instead a history, okay? And in the process, what he does, he ends up covering the whole big picture of church history because he's tracking theological education across church history. Big picture of church history, but I found, just because of the shortness of the volume, it's about 150 pages. I actually found that this gave me a bigger picture of, or gave me a good flyover of church history in general. And I think if you'll take a look at this resource, I think your experience with it might end up being the same. It's $20 Kindle. I am going to copy out his chapter summaries and then his last chapter. And I'm actually going to give that to you as kind of as your assigned reading for this class. Okay, so just for this lecture, I'm gonna ask you to read the chapter summary, final chapter, but it's only 30 pages altogether. It's really not a lot. But in the process, you'll get a sense of his book. You'll get kind of the overview of his book. And consider this as part of your reading requirement for the course overall. I would strongly encourage you to take a look at this book. Consider buying it, reading it, and I think you'll... Okay, I just got a message that I am losing my... I'm back. I froze because I switched internet connections there. So hopefully you can hear me okay. I apologize for my internet to do so. So I will paste in the link. Also comment and give you some of this information if you want to continue to consider looking at Mr. Gonzalez's book, the one I just mentioned to you. As part of this class assignment. Excellent. I think you'll very much enjoy it. And if we have time, I'll come back to this topic and we'll do some further discussion with this in another time. And there's the link for this recommended resource. And then I'll look forward to seeing you again next time when we hear back from Brother or Dr. Jason Arnold. You all have a good night.